Our next speaker is Jessica Flanigan from the University of Richmond, and she's going to talk to us about this. She'll explain that. Thank you. Jessica.
Hi, thank you for having me. So I'm Jess from the University of Richmond, as he said, and today I'm going to talk about an idea that I'm starting to work on. And the idea is, I'm just roughly calling it, let's call it market feminism. So it's a new research project I'm starting and a new movement that I think is kind of starting within activist, libertarian-ish policy circles. And I think that the project that I'm working on in the movement of market feminism are a break with a more recent trend in feminism, but they are really returning feminist ideals to their roots. So yes, I'm a feminist and a libertarian, but hear me out, you might like me anyhow. So historically, I think the origins of feminism can be found, or a version of the origins of feminism, the founding of America, when Abigail Adams was imploring her husband in designing the Constitution, remember the ladies, she said. And what was she saying when she said remember the ladies? She was saying, remember to extend property rights in a way that would be inclusive to women, because at the time, married women's property rights were held by their husbands. And so she was against that practice of coverture, which was like the idea that if you're a married woman, that your property rights are forfeited into your husband. And she says, remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. To which her husband, in this kind of unknowing performative gesture, responded in a letter to someone else, I could not help but laugh. He says to this, which is just like enacting the very thing that she was worried about, which was that if women weren't assigned these kind of thick property rights, that they would be left out of having a say over their lives in these ways. Well into the 19th century, women's rights advocates had a very market focus. So the Grimke sisters, who were abolitionists, also famously were in favor of women having these types of economic freedoms. So that's like a kind of historical core of the feminist tradition that I am hoping to kind of revise, where feminism is aligned with market rights, with economic freedoms. Yet, as the 20th century progressed, feminist scholarship increasingly favored more governmental solutions to gendered inequality rather than non-governmental solutions, which is what I'm associating with this idea of market feminism. So let's see what the critique is. Oh, there it is. So, can we have market feminism? So historically, in the 20th century, there's been a lot of criticism within feminist circles of capitalism and market society. So there's one class of criticism, which is criticizing something that they're calling neoliberal feminism. I always feel like when people say neoliberal, it's like a red flag, because they're just like saying, it's like that's kind of like boogeyman, like, ooh, neoliberal feminism, it's like coming to take your children or something. But like the word neoliberal is just, I think, what they're getting at is just a kind of libertarian or market-based feminism, where that neoliberal feminist critique is essentially that feminism shouldn't equate gender equality with success in the marketplace, because that idea of gendered equality is premised on an idea of economic and egalitarianism. And so they're arguing that feminists should be economic egalitarians as well, and that they're very critical of people like Sheryl Sandberg or Taylor Swift or even Beyonce. I know it's Texas, like heresy that we're saying anything bad about Beyonce, but some of them will say things about Beyonce which are like, you know, it shouldn't be that the feminist ideal of success is success in the marketplace, because that's going to be inherently leaving a lot of women behind. Another set of critiques are about feminist critiques of other types of markets. So feminist critiques of advertising and marketing, critiques of our kind of consumer culture and its effects on women, critiques of sex work specifically, which is some of what we talked about earlier and what some of my work is on, feminist critiques of the global marketplace, specifically focusing on sweatshops, which are primarily staffed by women and girls. But despite these critiques, my thesis is that feminists should embrace markets. And I also have a thesis that people who embrace markets should embrace feminism as well. So To those of you who kind of identify as like more like market-oriented types, I don't think that that view necessarily has to be in tension with the ideal of gender justice. And for those of you who identify as feminists in the room, I don't think that that idea has to be in tension with supporting the market. So we can all be friends, I hope. Let's start with neoliberal feminism. What's the critique? The critique is that a market society glorifies economic success, and the idea is that what we're actually doing when we talk about things like lean in is blinding ourselves to the problems that most women are actually facing, low-income women and women who are sort of marginalized within market society. Is that true? Like, does market society, mask us to the concerns of economically marginalized women and socially marginalized women? Is it actually a trap to think that success for women involves success within the market? I don't think it's a trap. Here's one reason. What has market societies brought us? Technological innovations in part. And these technological innovations have been one of the primary contributing factors to the liberation of women. So because of the production and development of products not being determined by central planners, but be determined by people's taste and talents and economic needs, entrepreneurs have a great incentive to develop products that will serve all people's needs, whether or not those people have political power or social power or not. So consider one of my favorite inventions, the washing machine. In 1920s, the average housewife spent 11 and a half hours a week on laundry and ironing. 11 and a half hours. That was in the 1920s. What a nightmare. By 1965, that had dropped to about 7 hours. In 2014, the average housewife or her spouse spent about 20 minutes per day on laundry, or about 1.5 hours per week, which is about what I spend. I listen to a podcast, I knock it out, and I can get on with the rest of my life. What am I doing with that time that I would have otherwise been spending doing laundry for me and my 3 kids? Oh, look, I have a job. Like now, because my job isn't laundry and running the house, I can have this job, which is way better. So just the ordinary technological innovation driven and brought to us by markets has liberated women to be able to enter into the workforce and use their talents in a way that is more suited to their own unique market advantages. More generally, there's this charge that market societies or market feminist ideology, which is the ideology that I'm defending, sort of glorify participation in capitalism. But is that a bad thing? Because what was the counterfactual? In the past, most women worked for free. It's not that most women didn't work, it's that most women didn't work for money. And so when feminist critics of Lean In, for example, will say things like, oh, look at Sheryl Sandberg, she looks like she's a real bootstraps feminist woman, but all of her success is dependent on the labor of women who are watching her kids or cleaning her house, and that's totally unacknowledged. That is acknowledged. And also, people who are watching her kids and cleaning her house, in the past, all women were watching kids and cleaning houses, and they weren't getting paid for it, and those women are getting paid for it. I feel like that's a plus on the feminist dimension. I don't think that we should be uncomfortable about the fact that when women enter into the workforce, other women are going to be paid to be watching their children and cleaning their houses. I don't think that's an uncomfortable fact at all. I think that that's a win-win. This is an example of the gains from trade that Dem was talking about earlier, where we used to have a system where people were artificially excluded from the marketplace, women, on the grounds that they should be watching their own children for free. And now we have a system where women are welcomed into the marketplace, and that marketplace also enables them to pay other people to watch their children for money. Markets are not zero-sum. When women join the market, they're able to negotiate these mutually beneficial exchanges. And even if the gains are in some ways asymmetric, which I think sometimes they are, as long as they're mutually beneficial, they're still better than the counterfactual when people were shut out of the marketplace artificially. I'm not saying that the modern workplace is necessarily right now a haven for women's rights. I think we've seen with this Me Too movement that there's still a long ways to go with treating women with respect in a lot of workplaces. I'm just saying that it's better than the alternative, and that more competition in the market, not less, will incentivize people to provide better working conditions for women. Now, sometimes people who are critical of the effect of market society and on women's rights will bring up the wage gap. And they'll say, look at the wage gap. That's proof that just pure unfettered capitalism is stacked against women's equality. And we need governmental solutions or some kind of governmental interventions in the market in order to secure better conditions for women. So things that would be prohibitions on wage discrimination, for example. Yeah, even very progressive publications like Vox.com, which it's definitely not standing for the market at Vox.com, but still, even they acknowledge that a very small percentage of the pay disparity is attributable to outright discrimination. Instead, a lot of the wage gap is attributable to differential choices that people are making, different industries that they go into. And that might be something that would persist even if you had these types of governmental solutions that were intended to provide wage equality. So for example, in the Netherlands, they have a lot of the gender equity policies that many American feminist critics of the markets advocate for. So regulations that are kind of equal pay regulations and a really strong social safety net that's enabling women to put their children in subsidized daycare and education. Still, the Netherlands has a very high wage gap. Why? Well, over 60% of the female labor force works part-time, despite the fact that they're not forced to watch their kids. We have state-subsidized daycare. Why are women working part-time? There was a kind of cheeky book called Dutch Women Don't Get Depressed. And the reason was because they want to work part-time. They have different values, and they valued working part-time. I think that if we're really going to respect women as the authors of their lives, we might have to accept the fact that they might make choices that reflect their own values that don't necessarily have the same values as men. And we should push back against this kind of what I think is a male normative standard, which assumes that equality for women requires equal outcomes or equal taste and preferences. People might have different preferences or different ideas. And that's okay. I'm not saying that there's no pay discrimination, but I'm saying that requiring equal pay or pointing to unequal pay simpliciter as a problem for gender equality is a misleading kind of framing. And it's also somewhat paternalistic to think that women can't make these choices that are going to reflect their own taste and talents when they're in the workplace. So historically, women were excluded from dangerous workplaces, demanding occupations, men's industries, like medicine, for frankly paternalistic reasons, thinking that women couldn't handle it, women would be damaged in some ways by participating in these industries, and also because of paternalistic reasons against the family, so worries about women leaving their own families. But as early feminist activists argued, the feminist activists in the beginning of the 20th century who were advocating for more occupational freedom for women, let women decide whether or not an occupation or a wage or a system of hours is in their overall interest. Who's the best judge of your overall interest? You. And so if you are the best judge of your overall interest, that also applies to me. And so if I'm making decisions that are reflecting my overall values and they happen to be systematically different from other groups, that doesn't necessarily signal any kind of ex-ante injustice. But what about the system as a whole? So a second feminist critique of the market, which I think is worth addressing, sort of relates to this idea that Jim was talking about, materialism, right? So there's this criticism that currently consumerism, consumer culture, capitalism is forcing people or promoting people to have these preferences that are really gendered. So for example, I have up there, thick pens for her. And so instead of actually addressing women's needs, the feminist critique goes, instead, women's interests are being used as a kind of marketing ploy where companies are doing things like selling self-consciousness or making it so that women develop these preferences to think that in some ways they should be participating in markets that they wouldn't otherwise do. So like buying makeup, for example, or buying the pink pens. And I'm kind of interested in this critique because it does assume, I think, like a male baseline. So how does the critique go? The critique is, well, consumer culture is set up in a way that makes women feel inadequate, or it's set up in a way that makes women feel like they have to pay for highlights or get a gel manicure or buy the pink pens to be more feminized, and that's a problem. But why is that a problem? That's only a problem if you're assuming a kind of male normative baseline. If you're assuming that the thing that equality would look like is that nobody wears makeup, that everybody has blue and black pens. But why not think that maybe equality would look like everybody wears makeup or everybody uses the pink pens? And then we would think oh, well, that would just be a kind of bizarre result because people might, maybe the men don't want to wear the makeup or maybe the men don't want to have the blue and the black pens. Yes, maybe the women do want to wear the makeup, maybe the women do want the pinker pens. And what the market does is it responds to these different tastes and talents that people have. But a simpliciter view of equality is going to have some kind of baseline. And when we're picking a baseline, when we think about what will the moral baseline be, or what will the baseline for, allocating our consumer goods or our priorities about production be, if you have a system where men are making more decisions or men have more power, if you're living under patriarchy, which we are, because men may have more power and they make more of the decisions, it's going to default to a male normative baseline. It's going to be the blue pen. It's not going to be the pink pen. And so I think that these types of calls for not having more gender differentiation within markets on the grounds that having gender differentiation in markets entrenches gender dichotomies or patronizes women or causes women to have these adaptive preferences are sort of overplaying the hand, because when you think about what would equality look like, it's probably going to default to a male normative baseline. So it's true that there are whole areas of consumer culture that are targeted towards women, and that in some ways there might be objections to that. That's also true of consumer culture that's targeted towards men. But what's the alternative, once again? So you can kind of see a theme here, which is yeah, there are some feminist critiques of the market, but what's your alternative? There's also this kind of elitism here, assuming that the types of products that are being marketed to women or the ways that consumer culture is targeting women is inducing women to have these adaptive preferences. And this adaptive preference language is also seen in a lot of feminist circles, where the idea is, well, women don't want to stay home and raise their own kids or something. They're doing that because they have adaptive preferences or something. I think that the adaptive preference charge is extremely dangerous, because what it's essentially saying is that people are being brainwashed by their circumstances and they're not developing their preferences in response to rational incentives. And in the past, in the bad old days, there were a lot of people who were talking about oh, irrational women can't make their own decisions. And that was really sexist when people had that view of women being too irrational to own property because they're just gonna blow it all on cakes and cupcakes and whatever. I don't know. I don't know what they thought in the 19th century. It was a dark time. But whatever they were thinking, it was a totally sexist idea to think that women weren't capable of freely developing their own preferences over goods because they were brainwashed by social forces. We should reject that today as well. We should reject these sort of adaptive preference arguments. If a person tells you that they have a preference over a product or over a position, believe them. Now, here's a third feminist critique, is that more generally, the market objectifies women. And it could objectify people as objects of labor, but oftentimes feminist criticisms are especially worried about sexual objectification. So the worry is about sex work, but also pornography, stripping, and even advertising, like Victoria's Secret models, which is that, if people are forced to sell their labor in the marketplace, asymmetries in tastes and talents are going to determine people's advantages, and women are going to have an advantage in markets where they're selling female sexuality. And by selling female sexuality, that turns women into sex objects. So some feminist scholars like Ray Langton or Catherine McKinnon have said, literally, it objectifies women. I think that's a mistake, because I do think that certain things do consist in treating women as an object. So sexual assault is an objectifying act. It treats women as objects. But I don't think that a person is treated as an object if they are treated in ways that they have consented to. And so it's a mistake to use the language of objectification, which is an extremely serious charge, to characterize women's voluntary choices. Actually, it deprives those women of the very agency that you're saying that you're setting out to protect. I also think that this kind of sexual moralism that we see on the left is similar to kinds of sexual moralism that we see on the right. So it's a sort of bootleggers and Baptist coalition here, where like the right and the left wings both have these kind of puritanical ideas about female sexuality being isolated in this special domain of human experience. And that purity culture is just as present within kind of more left-wing feminist movement as it is within the right. And we should be extremely suspicious of those types of cultures because I think that they consist in just imposing perfectionistic ideals about how people should enact their own sexualities. I also think that even if you don't agree with me about those types of moralistic judgments being out of line, as we saw in the previous presentation, the harms of prohibition are worse. Prohibition not only violates people's freedom of association or their economic freedom or the rights to express their own sexual identities, it also just has horrible consequences. So even if you think that these practices are wrongful in some ways, any kind of policy like censoring pornography, for example, won't eliminate the problem. It would just make it so that it's in the black market, which, as we've seen, is pretty dangerous because once you make something illegal, the people who are more likely to participate in it are people who don't really care about the laws. And so just, I'm going to skip that point because we'll get to this. All right, here's the fourth critique I want to talk about, which is the global dimensions of feminism. And I'll tell you a story about where this critique comes up. So Beyonce had a line of kind of girl power clothing line a couple years ago called Ivy Park. I'm looking at the crowd, probably not a lot of folks here were like buying leggings from Ivy Park. Maybe, which shout out to the Hive, but probably not. But then Beyonce got in a lot of trouble from the very people who she was seeking alliance with, because it turned out that her Ivy Park leggings line was manufactured in a Sri Lankan sweatshop, which is populated by female workers who are making about $1 a day. And so then a lot of people say, how can you call this a feminist clothing line when it's being manufactured in Sri Lanka by these women who are making $1 a day? Her response was to be not make the line anymore. So she kind of was like, oh, I'm out. But I think that there's a stronger response, which is, what is the counterfactual for the people who were making Beyonce's Ivy Park leggings? So there have been some studies of the effects of having the garment industry enter into a person's community, coming near the village in places like Bangladesh. What's the effect on women of having sweatshops open near them? So villages in Bangladesh, this is where this graph is from, that had a sweatshop open near them had substantially lower rates of child marriage and higher rates of child education. So girls who lived in villages near sweatshops were 28% less likely to get pregnant and 29% less likely to be married in their early adolescence than women or girls who lived further away from sweatshops. Villages that are near sweatshops had 39% higher rates of investment in female school enrollment. Many NGOs have pointed out that women are disproportionately vulnerable to the harms of extreme poverty in the global world. This is a graph over time of poverty in Bangladesh. What happened over this time is the expansion of the garment industry. So it does look like these are really disempowering jobs relative to the jobs that we enjoy here in America, but relative to subsistence farming, early marriage, working at home, this is the path to female empowerment long term. And there have been cross-national studies that have shown that political empowerment for women correlates with economic development more generally, and also that rates of domestic violence decline as the labor market value of a woman goes up. So it doesn't look great to look at that picture, but then you have to think, what's the picture that we would have had in the place when there weren't those leggings being made by Beyonce? Now, this brings us to some institutional questions. So I've tried to make the case here that, I feel like a lot of my friends are feminists, and my feminist friends are very skeptical about markets. A lot of my friends are libertarians. My libertarian friends, sort of oblivious to feminism, frankly, a lot of them. Not necessarily anti, but kind of not bringing it into focus. But I think that there's some area for institutional points where we can bring these two sides into more agreement and kind of build from there. I think that the feminist skepticism of markets is misplaced, and I think that libertarian and kind of pro-market obliviousness to women's concerns and arguments about women's concerns is also misplaced. Here are some places where we can agree. So the next move, sorry, my paper is stuck, relates to caring for children. Oh, it's not, I just don't have the paper, but I can say it. So right now in the tax code, there's a marriage penalty for people who are married and they both make about the same amount of money. So my husband and I have the same job, there's a marriage penalty in that tax code. We would have a tax bonus if we made the same amount of money, but I stayed home and watched the kid. So our tax code currently is stacked in such a way that it incentivizes women to opt out of the workforce because, frankly, it is going to be women if one of the partners is going to be opting out of the workforce. More generally, there's like all of these like low-hanging fruits when it comes to reform that both kind of pro-market sides and also the kind of more feminist side can get behind. So, for example, using school and childcare vouchers, like that's a solution that like a lot of libertarians have favored for caring for children, and also which feminists could see as a means for like giving women more options if they want to be able to make the decision to leave the workplace or not. That's like a poor, like tax, changing the tax code, like, okay, that's like low-hanging fruit. Here's a more ambitious proposal that I like, basic income. You might be like, Jess, like you said you were a capitalist, like what's going on with like you liking the basic income? I do like the basic income. You know who else liked the basic income? Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, you should too. I think that the basic income could be seen as a sort of rebate for the rights violation or the initial infringement of people's rights that is involved in the imposition of markets. So while I do think that a market society is morally best, and I do think that like capitalism has all of these wonderful welfare gains for people, I also do think that enforcing property law rules along the lines of capitalism is an infringement of people's natural rights, and that you should give them a rebate so that they don't have to be forced into the workplace to work until they die if they don't want to be. That's what the basic income is. And a lot of the proponents of the basic income have been people who are responding to things like technological change and the robots taking our jobs and stuff. But there's also a strong feminist case to be made for the basic income, which is we've set up this society in a way where, you know, if people are all going to be working, who's going to watch the children? Like, who's going to actually care for families? And the feminist case for the basic income is a way of making it so that you have this kind of baseline provision of a voucher for children or an income for people that enables people to either opt out of the workforce or pay for childcare when they go into the workforce. So I think that there's like this natural place for building sort of alliances left to right around these types of causes, which I look forward to hearing questions. I see some faces and you guys seem so excited about it, so I'm just going to let you get to it. So in conclusion, feminists should embrace the power of markets. So to my feminist friends in the room, markets. They could be good for women, globally, domestically. Think about it. Also, capitalists should embrace feminism. Now, I do think that you should still oppose legal mandates, right? I'm not saying we should have like occupational or wage regulations or anything, but I do think also that libertarians, capitalists, people who are generally pro-market should also be behind cultural change that treats women as equals within the workplace and the marketplace, and should kind of get behind the feminist cause of like, let's all treat people like humans and equals. Like that would be a great success. So the capitalists shouldn't be so oblivious to the feminist cause because it has a lot to align with them. And the feminists shouldn't be so hostile to the market cause because markets have a lot to offer everybody, including women. Thanks.
Thank you. When we were setting up the program, I thought about giving Jess just 70% of what all the men got, but we actually gave her all the time. We started a few minutes late after the break, and we're pretty much at the end of this session. But but we started late, so we want to have time for maybe two short questions. Joe, and then Michael.
Well, an obvious question that maybe others share with me is, how is it a violation of somebody's natural rights to force them to work voluntarily?
Some stuff, yeah. I'll tell you. Yes, you own your body, and you have natural rights over your body. And I think that that is a core feminist insight and a core libertarian insight, and like that is where we align. What about external property? What about appropriations from the earth? What about intellectual property laws? What about the money system? Is that something that's like a product of just free contract, voluntary exchange? We can imagine institutions emerging in like a stateless society that would look that way, but no, the current property system is something that governments make up, impose on everybody coercively, and force us all to comply with. So like going back to Thomas Paine, I think that like compensation for the natural rights violation that consists in the establishment of that type of property system, allocating land rights, rights over natural resources, intellectual property rights, and money systems, that is a natural rights violation because it's enforced using coercive threats which are against the body of a person. So you should get a rebate.
All right, so anybody who hangs out with little kids knows that girls are different than boys. I don't know if that's your experience, but if not, you have very odd children.
I do have odd kids, but the girls are different than boys as well.
So, and that gets to the bigger point, which is that human nature matters, and I think, and you feel free to disagree, of course, that the nature of women is different than the nature of men, not in every respect, but in some respects. Feminists, on the other hand, seem really reluctant to acknowledge that, and you can understand why, because to acknowledge that is to set yourself on a slippery slope. So how do you deal with that issue when you talk about this with feminists?
This is an old debate within feminist theory. So Susan Oken was a feminist who thought that we should strive for a gender-blind society where your gender and sex was as relevant to your lifetime prospects as your eye color. But recently, many people have said that actually striving for a gender-blind society would be counterproductive to the interest of women because women have a lot of things like related to childbirth, for example, that do mean that they have a special target of concern. So a lot of the efforts institutionally to achieve like a gender-blind society, for example, paternity leave mandates in Scandinavian countries, many feminists currently have a kind of backlash against it because they say, actually, it looks like maybe paternity leave just helps men get ahead further because like then they have this time while like their wives are watching the kids in nursing because women have to nurse biologically, like men can't do it. And then those men are just like chilling and like working on their book manuscript or whatever. And so like it's difficult to legislate. And I think most of those basic differences do have to do with reproduction. And there could be like socialized differences for both sexes that are kind of like toxic and destructive that we can't know if they would be like, you know, a natural, if those asymmetries would emerge but for sexist attitudes or something. But like, yeah, related to reproduction, there's like just there. So it's a hard debate whether or not, with just internal to feminism, whether or not we should strive for a gender-blind society or whether we should acknowledge those differences or even celebrate those differences for both.
Okay, thank you.